This actually happened. In 1923 Germany, a woman paid for her morning coffee, left the cup on the table to use the restroom, and returned to find the price had doubled. Workers demanded to be paid twice per day because by afternoon, their morning wages couldn't buy lunch. Parents burned stacks of cash in their fireplaces because the paper money was cheaper than firewood. But here's what nobody tells you about the Weimar hyperinflation. It didn't start with economic mismanagement. It started with a peace treaty, and it didn't end with economic reform. It ended with the rise of Adolf Hitler. The question everyone asks is, how did Germany's currency collapse so catastrophically? But that's the wrong question. The right question is, why did ordinary Germans, facing economic annihilation, willingly embrace the very extremism that would destroy them? Because the answer reveals a pattern that's repeating right now in countries you've actually heard of, and the warning signs are identical. Today, we're going deep into one of history's most devastating economic collapses to understand not just what happened, but why it keeps happening. And by the end, you'll see why this story matters more today than ever before. To understand how Germany's money became worthless, we need to rewind to November 1918. World War I has just ended. Germany has surrendered. 4 years of brutal warfare have left the nation exhausted, its economy shattered, its people starving under British naval blockades that prevented food imports. Millions are dead, the Kaiser has abdicated, and a fragile new democracy called the Weimar Republic is trying to hold the country together. But Germany's problems are just beginning. In June 1919, German representatives are summoned to the Palace of Versailles outside Paris. What they encounter there will set in motion a chain of events that destroys their currency, their economy, and ultimately their democracy. The Allied powers present them with the Treaty of Versailles. This isn't a negotiation, this is a dictation. Germany must accept full responsibility for the war and pay reparations to the victors. The amount? 132 billion gold marks. In today's money, roughly $442 billion. Let me put that in perspective. Germany's entire annual economic output before the war was about 50 billion marks. They're being asked to pay nearly 3 times their total GDP, and they've just lost the war, lost territory, lost their industrial heartlands, and their economy is in ruins. The chief economist, John Maynard Keynes, who was actually at Versailles representing Britain, saw the disaster coming. He resigned in protest and wrote a book warning that these reparations would lead to economic collapse and political catastrophe. He was ignored. The treaty was signed, and Germany's fate was sealed, but not in the way anyone expected. Here's where the story takes its first twist. The hyperinflation that destroyed Germany didn't happen immediately. In fact, right after the war, Germany's economy seemed to be recovering faster than Britain's or France's. Unemployment was low, factories were humming. So what changed? Why did the currency suddenly collapse 4 years later? The answer involves a calculated gamble by Germany's government, a French invasion, and a weapon that no one expected: the printing press. To understand how Germany ended up printing money into worthlessness, we need to understand the trap they were caught in from the very beginning. The Treaty of Versailles didn't just demand money, it demanded gold marks, which meant payments had to be made in gold or foreign currency like British pounds or American dollars. Germany couldn't just print marks to pay the reparations because no one would accept marks for international debts. They needed real hard currency backed by something of value. So how do you get foreign currency when your economy is devastated? You export goods and earn it. Germany tried. They ramped up industrial production, exported coal and manufactured goods, and used the foreign currency they earned to make reparation payments. But there was a problem. The more they exported, the less they had for their own people. The more they paid in reparations, the less they had to invest in rebuilding. And here's where German politicians made a fateful decision. Between 1919 and 1921, instead of raising taxes dramatically to fund reparations and government spending, they chose a different path. They printed money. It seemed like a clever solution. Print marks to pay for government expenses at home, use export earnings for reparations abroad, and avoid the political suicide of massive tax increases on a population already suffering from food shortages and war exhaustion. The head of the German Reichsbank, Rudolf Hovenstein, believed he had no choice. The government needed money to function, to pay civil servants, to maintain order in a country teetering on the edge of communist revolution. When politicians demanded money, Hovenstein printed it. The money supply began to grow, 100 billion marks in circulation in 1919, 200 billion by 1920, 500 billion by 1921. But at first, it seemed to work. The German economy was growing. Unemployment stayed low. Factories were humming. So what changed? Why did the currency suddenly collapse 4 years later? The answer involves a calculated gamble by Germany's government, a French invasion, and a weapon that no one expected, the printing press. Better be found ruthless than weak. The consequences will not be tolerated. Before we dive into how the currency became worthless, let's step back for a moment. What's happening in Germany during the early 1920s isn't just an economic issue, it's a social and political one. The Weimar Republic is fragile, facing threats from both far-right and far-left extremism. In the streets, political violence is a frequent occurrence. Marches and rallies, political assassinations, clashes between paramilitary groups. This is the backdrop against which the currency begins to weaken. And here we see the seeds of a dangerous pattern. When governments unable to solve their real problems resort to shortcuts, they play with public trust. And when public trust in a nation's money erodes, so do the trust in institutions, the leaders, and even in one another. The economic instability fueled by money printing becomes the fertile ground on which democracy begins to wither. The German government seemed to believe that they could manage the influence of increasing money supply with careful control, but they were underestimating the beast they were creating. In 1922, the Allied powers demanded that Germany accelerate its reparation payments. This pressure, combined with increasing deficits at home, pushed the Reichsbank into overdrive. The money supply continued to swell. Prices started to spiral up out of control. The economic time bomb had been set, ticking loudly.
And then in January 1923, everything fell apart. France had been watching Germany's reparation payments with growing frustration. The payments were late. The amounts were inadequate. The French economy was struggling with its own war debts to Britain and America. French politicians needed Germany's reparations to rebuild their devastated northern regions and to pay their own debts. When Germany defaulted on a timber delivery in late 1922, France decided to take matters into their own hands. On January 11, 1923, French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland. This region produced 80% of Germany's coal and steel. France's plan was simple. If Germany wouldn't pay, France would seize the goods directly. They would occupy the mines and factories and take the coal, steel, and manufactured goods as payment in kind. The German government faced an impossible choice. They couldn't fight back militarily. They were forbidden from having a significant army under the Versailles Treaty. But they also couldn't be seen as capitulating to foreign occupation. So they chose a third option, one that would prove catastrophic: passive resistance. The government called on German workers in the Ruhr to go on strike. Don't work for the occupiers, they said. Shut down the mines, stop the factories. We'll pay your wages while you resist. And the workers responded. The entire industrial heart of Germany ground to a halt. It was an act of national defiance and economic suicide rolled into one. Because now Germany had a new problem. They were paying the wages of millions of workers who weren't producing anything. They were losing the output of their most productive region, and they still had reparations to pay and a government to fund. The government's solution? Print more money. Much more money. The Reichsbank went into overdrive. Rudolf Hovenstein, still convinced that the real problem was foreign speculation and the French occupation, not the money supply, ordered his printing presses to run day and night. New presses were commissioned. The government even hired private printing companies because the Reichsbank couldn't keep up with demand. By August 1923, 300 paper mills and 150 printing companies were working around the clock to print German marks. And that's when the hyperinflation truly began. In January 1923, when the Ruhr occupation began, the exchange rate was 18,000 marks to $1. Bad, but manageable. By July, it was 350,000 marks to the dollar. By August, 4 million marks to the dollar. By October, 25 billion marks to the dollar. And by November, at the peak of the hyperinflation, the exchange rate hit 4.2 trillion marks to a single US dollar. Let me say that again, 4,200 billion marks for $1. A postage stamp cost 50 billion marks. A single egg cost 320 billion marks. A loaf of bread, which had cost 250 marks in January, cost 200 billion marks by November. If you had saved 1 million marks in 1922 thinking you were wealthy, by November 1923, that million marks couldn't buy you a single cigarette. The stories from this period seem almost impossible. Restaurants stopped printing prices on menus because they would change before the meal was finished. Workers were paid in the morning and rushed to spend the money at lunch because it would be worth half as much by evening. People carried money in wheelbarrows, suitcases, and laundry baskets. There are photographs of children playing with stacks of worthless bills like building blocks, of people wallpapering their homes with banknotes because wallpaper was more expensive than currency. But beneath the surreal images, real horror was unfolding. The hyperinflation didn't just destroy money, it destroyed lives, relationships, and society itself. The middle class was annihilated overnight. These were the people who had done everything right. They had saved money, bought government bonds, invested in insurance policies, put money in pension funds. They were the teachers, small business owners, civil servants, doctors, and lawyers who formed the backbone of German society. And suddenly, all of it was worthless. A lifetime of savings couldn't buy a week's groceries. Government bonds that were supposed to fund retirement became scrap paper. The social contract that said hard work and responsibility would provide security had been shredded. For the working class, the suffering was even more immediate. Wages couldn't keep up with prices no matter how often they were raised. Workers would receive a wage increase only to find that prices had already risen faster. Malnutrition soared. The infant mortality rate climbed. People ate grass, tree bark, and anything they could scavenge. Crime exploded as desperate people stole not money, but food, coal, anything with real value.
But here's what's crucial to understand. Not everyone suffered. While the middle class was being destroyed, a different group was prospering wildly. Speculators who understood what was happening bought real assets with borrowed money, then repaid the loans with worthless currency. Industrialists who owed debts watched those debts evaporate. People with access to foreign currency could buy German assets for pennies. The nation's wealth was being redistributed not through policy or fairness, but through monetary chaos. And this created something psychologically devastating, visible inequality during collective suffering. While families starved, others threw lavish parties. While workers lined up at soup kitchens, speculators bought villas. The sense that the system was rigged, that someone was profiting from the national catastrophe, poisoned German society. The social fabric began to tear. Crime wasn't just about theft anymore. It was about violence, about rage. Political extremism, both communist and fascist, flourished. Street battles between political factions became routine. The government seemed powerless to stop any of it. Democracy itself began to look like weakness, like chaos. And into this chaos stepped a man who had been watching and waiting. Adolf Hitler and his National Socialist German Workers' Party had been a fringe movement before the hyperinflation, but now their message resonated. They blamed the Weimar Republic for the hyperinflation. They blamed the Treaty of Versailles. They blamed international bankers, Jewish conspiracies, communist traitors. They promised order, strength, and revenge, and people listened. In November 1923, at the absolute peak of the hyperinflation, Hitler attempted the beer hall putsch in Munich, trying to overthrow the Bavarian government as a first step to seizing power in Germany. The putsch failed. Hitler was arrested and imprisoned, but the trial made him famous. His message spread, and the economic catastrophe gave him the audience he needed. But here's the question nobody asks. If the hyperinflation was so catastrophic, why didn't the government stop it sooner? Why did Rudolf Havenstein keep printing money even as the currency collapsed around him? The answer reveals something terrifying about how economic disasters unfold.
Rudolf Havenstein, the head of the Reichsbank, was not an idiot. He was a career banker, technically competent, and by all accounts believed he was doing his patriotic duty. But he was trapped in a mental framework that prevented him from seeing the truth until it was far too late. Havenstein believed the hyperinflation was caused by external factors, the reparations, the French occupation, currency speculators, and Germany's trade deficit. He genuinely thought that printing more money was the solution, not the cause. His logic went like this: businesses need money to operate, workers need to be paid, the government needs to function, therefore the Reichsbank must provide adequate money supply. If there's not enough money in circulation, that would cause deflation and economic contraction, which would be even worse. This is what's called a real bills doctrine, the idea that as long as money is being lent for productive economic activity, printing more money doesn't cause inflation. Havenstein watched prices rise and concluded that Germany simply needed more money to accommodate those prices. He saw effect and cause backwards. Other economists and politicians could see the truth. Karl Helfferich, a former finance minister, understood that the money printing was the problem. Hjalmar Schacht, a banker who would later become Reichsbank president, knew the currency had to be stabilized. International observers warned repeatedly that Germany was on a path to monetary annihilation, but Havenstein had the power, and he refused to stop printing. Why? Because stopping meant confronting impossible political choices. If you stop printing money, how do you pay government salaries? How do you support the striking workers in the Ruhr? How do you maintain social order when you can't afford police or civil services? Havenstein chose monetary collapse over immediate political crisis, always believing he could manage the inflation, always believing it would stabilize, always being proven catastrophically wrong. It took external intervention to finally end the hyperinflation. In November 1923, the German government abandoned passive resistance in the Ruhr. The workers went back to work, the government stopped paying their strike wages, and most crucially, they introduced a new currency, the Rentenmark. The Rentenmark was a psychological trick more than an economic solution. It was supposedly backed by Germany's agricultural and industrial assets, though this backing was largely theoretical. What mattered was that people believed it had value. One Rentenmark was set equal to 1 trillion old marks. The government committed to printing only a limited amount. Hjalmar Schacht, who managed the transition, made it clear there would be no more unlimited money printing. And it worked. Almost overnight, the hyperinflation stopped. Prices stabilized, commerce returned to normal, the German economy began to function again. Rudolf Havenstein, still insisting his policies had been correct, died in November 1923, days before the new currency was introduced. Schacht took over and implemented strict monetary discipline. But the damage was permanent. An entire generation's wealth had been destroyed. Trust in institutions was shattered. The middle class, once the defenders of democracy, had been radicalized by their impoverishment, and the extremists who promised to restore Germany's greatness had gained a foothold they would never relinquish.
Hitler spent 9 months in prison for the beer hall push. He used the time to write Mein Kampf and to reorganize his strategy. He learned that he couldn't seize power through violence. He had to win it through democratic means, then dismantle democracy from within. And the hyperinflation had given him exactly the audience he needed. People who no longer believed in the system, who wanted someone strong to blame for their suffering, who were willing to trade freedom for stability. By 1933, just 10 years after the hyperinflation, Hitler was Chancellor of Germany. By 1934, he was dictator. And the rest is the darkest chapter in human history. Here's what should terrify you. The pattern that destroyed Weimar Germany is playing out right now in multiple countries around the world, and the warning signs are identical. Venezuela's hyperinflation began in 2016. At its peak in 2019, the inflation rate hit 344,509% per year. A cup of coffee that cost 450 bolivars in 2016 cost 1.5 million bolivars by 2019. The cause? The government printed money to finance spending after oil revenues collapsed. Sound familiar? The Venezuelan central bank insisted they had no choice. The government needed to function. Workers needed to be paid. They couldn't cut spending because that would cause social unrest, so they printed, and the currency collapsed. Zimbabwe experienced hyperinflation from 2007 to 2009, reaching an estimated peak of 89.76 trillion% per year. The Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe eventually printed a 100 trillion Zimbabwe dollar note. It wasn't enough to buy a bus ticket. The government printed to finance land redistribution, pay government workers, and maintain political power. When inflation accelerated, they printed more. The pattern is identical. Argentina has experienced persistent high inflation for decades, with hyperinflation episodes in the 1980s hitting 3,000% annually. Turkey's inflation reached 85% in 2022. Lebanon's currency lost over 90% of its value between 2019 and 2021. In each case, the story is the same. Governments facing impossible choices print money rather than make painful cuts or raise taxes. Inflation accelerates. Governments print more to compensate, and the cycle spirals out of control. But the parallels go beyond economics. Look at what happens socially. In Venezuela, violent crime exploded as the currency collapsed. The middle class fled the country by the millions. Trust in institutions evaporated. Strongman politics gained support. In Zimbabwe, social order broke down. In Lebanon, political extremism surged. The pattern repeats. Economic catastrophe doesn't just destroy wealth, it destroys the social consensus that holds democracies together. And here's the most disturbing parallel. Just like in Weimar Germany, these hyperinflations are creating winners and losers. In Venezuela, government insiders with access to dollars became wealthy while ordinary people starved. In Zimbabwe, the politically connected bought farms and businesses with worthless currency. The inequality isn't a bug, it's a feature. Economic chaos redistributes wealth to those who understand what's happening and have access to real assets or foreign currency. Now, you might be thinking, this could never happen in major developed economies like the United States, the European Union, or Japan. They would never print enough money to cause hyperinflation. Except that after the 2008 financial crisis and again during the COVID-19 pandemic, that's exactly what they did. Central banks expanded their balance sheets by trillions. The money supply exploded. The United States M2 money supply increased by 40% between February 2020 and February 2021, the fastest expansion since World War II. Did it cause hyperinflation? No, and that's important to understand. Not all money printing causes hyperinflation. The critical difference is productive capacity and confidence. If your economy can produce goods and services to match the money supply, and if people believe the currency will retain value, inflation remains manageable. Germany in 1923 couldn't produce because the Ruhr was occupied. Venezuela couldn't produce because oil revenues collapsed and industry was destroyed. Zimbabwe couldn't produce because agricultural land redistribution destroyed farming capacity. But here's the warning. The gap between manageable inflation and hyperinflation can close faster than anyone expects. Germany's inflation was manageable in 1922. By 1923, it was catastrophic. The tipping point isn't gradual, it's exponential. Once people lose confidence in the currency, once they believe it'll be worth less tomorrow than today, they spend it immediately. Velocity of money increases, demand for real assets explodes, and the spiral becomes self-reinforcing. We're seeing warning signs right now. Inflation in developed economies reached levels in 2021 and 2022 not seen in 40 years. Central banks printed unprecedented amounts of money. Government debt reached record levels. The political will to raise taxes or cut spending is nearly non-existent in most democracies. The same impossible choices that faced Weimar Germany are facing governments today. Make painful cuts or print money. And printing always seems easier. But there's an even more disturbing parallel we haven't discussed yet, the political consequences. The Weimar hyperinflation doesn't just destroy German economy, it destroyed German democracy, and it did so through a mechanism that's repeating right now.
Economic catastrophe creates a demand for simple answers and strong leaders. When your life savings becomes worthless overnight, you want someone to blame. When the democratic government seems powerless to stop the chaos, authoritarianism starts to look appealing. When you see others prospering while you suffer, conspiracy theories about rigged systems and hidden elites become believable. Hitler's rise wasn't about economic policy. It was about providing meaning to suffering. He told Germans they hadn't failed. They'd been betrayed. The hyperinflation wasn't the result of impossible choices and bad decisions. It was the result of traitors, foreign enemies, and scapegoated minorities. He promised to restore not just prosperity, but pride, not just stability, but strength. And here's what's crucial. Hitler didn't need everyone to believe him. He just needed enough people to be desperate enough to take a chance on someone who promised to smash the system that had failed them. In the 1928 elections, before the Great Depression, the Nazi Party won just 2.6% of the vote. By 1930, after years of economic hardship, they won 18.3%. By 1932, they were the largest party in the Reichstag with 37.3%. Economic catastrophe had created the conditions for democratic collapse. Look around the world today. Populist strongman politics are rising in democracies across the globe, not just in countries experiencing hyperinflation, but in countries experiencing economic stress, inequality, and loss of faith in institutions. Brazil, Italy, Hungary, Turkey, the Philippines, India, and yes, even in the United States and Western Europe, where extremist parties are gaining support by promising to overthrow the establishment. The pattern is consistent. Economic hardship plus visible inequality plus institutional failure equals political extremism. And monetary policy, the decision about how much money to print and who benefits from that money, is at the heart of the pattern. Here's what the Weimar story teaches us. Hyperinflation is profitable for extremism, not just metaphorically, but literally. Chaos creates opportunities for those who promise order. Economic devastation creates audiences for those who promise revenge. And monetary collapse creates the conditions where people willingly trade freedom for stability. The question isn't whether developed economies will experience Weimar-style hyperinflation. The question is whether they'll experience enough economic stress and inequality to create the political conditions that made extremism profitable in Weimar Germany. And on that front, the warning signs are flashing red. So what are the lessons from Germany's hyperinflation that matter today? First, hyperinflation is a political choice, not an economic accident. Every hyperinflation in history has occurred because governments chose to print money rather than make difficult decisions about spending, taxes, and priorities. Rudolf Hovenstein could have stopped printing. The government could have cut spending, raised taxes, or defaulted on obligations. They chose not to because those options seemed politically impossible. But printing money didn't avoid the impossible choice. It just delayed it and made the consequences catastrophically worse. When you see governments today facing the choice between fiscal discipline and monetary expansion, understand that they're standing at the same crossroads Germany faced in 1923. Second, the social and political consequences of monetary collapse are worse than the economic consequences. Germany's economy recovered from the hyperinflation within a few years. The Rentenmark stabilized, industry rebuilt, trade resumed. But the psychological damage, the destroyed trust, the radicalized population, those never recovered. 10 years after the hyperinflation ended, Hitler was in power. The path from monetary collapse to fascism isn't automatic, but it's frighteningly common. When you destroy people's savings, you destroy their faith in the system. And when people lose faith in democratic institutions, they become willing to try anything else. Third, the warning signs are visible long before the catastrophe. Germany's hyperinflation didn't come out of nowhere. There were years of rising inflation, growing money supply, expanding government spending, and political paralysis before the final collapse. The people who understood what was happening could protect themselves by buying real assets, getting foreign currency, or leaving the country. But most people trusted that their government and their central bank knew what they were doing. That trust was misplaced. Today, when you see persistent inflation, exploding money supply, record government debt, and political unwillingness to make hard choices, those are the same warning signs. They don't guarantee hyperinflation, but they indicate a system under stress that could break faster than anyone expects.
The Weimar hyperinflation is often treated as a historical curiosity, a bizarre episode of money becoming literally worthless, but that's missing the point. The hyperinflation was a symptom of deeper failures, the failure to make difficult choices, the failure to understand how monetary systems work, and the failure to recognize that economic policy has moral and political consequences. The printing press didn't just create worthless money, it created desperate people, and desperate people, faced with the collapse of everything they believed in, became willing to embrace the unthinkable. That's the real lesson of 1923. That's the real warning for today. Because right now, governments around the world are facing the same impossible choices Germany faced: print money or make painful cuts, expand the money supply or accept economic contraction, maintain spending or maintain the currency. And the decisions they're making today will determine not just the value of money tomorrow, but the stability of democratic societies for the generation to come. The Weimar hyperinflation shows us that the distance between a functioning democracy and authoritarian catastrophe can be measured in the speed at which money becomes worthless. And that's not just a historical lesson, that's a present danger. If this video changed how you think about money, inflation, and political stability, subscribe, because we're going to keep exploring the patterns that keep repeating in economic history. And if you want to understand how to protect yourself in an era of monetary instability, check out the video in the description about how wealth actually survives economic collapse. The strategies haven't changed much since 1923, and they might matter more than you think.